Vice President Harris may visit the U.S.-Mexico border during her trip to Arizona on Friday. She'll be seeking to counterbalance former President Trump, who has made an immigration issue and has been driving that behind his campaign's issues and messages. Trump currently leads the vice president on immigration by more than 20 points among registered voters, according to recent NBC polling. Now joining us this morning, NBC News contributor Paola Ramos, former deputy director of Hispanic media for the Hillary Clinton campaign and author of the new book, Defectors, The Rise of the Latino Far Right and What It Means for America, and Stuart Stevens, former chief strategist to Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign and senior advisor with the Lincoln Project. So, Paola, I know you were just in Arizona, got back from there. You were there just last week. How is the issue of immigration playing there, and how is it different there than maybe in other states?
Absolutely. So I think let's remember that immigration is deeply personal for a lot of folks in Arizona. Now, this is a state where Joe Biden won in November of 2020 by less than 1%, Jose. And part of the reason why he was able to win that vote is because Latino voters that make up over a quarter of eligible voters in a battleground state like Arizona, Latino voters there were mobilized, inspired by the promise that Joe Biden made specifically on comprehensive immigration reform. No, they were mobilized and inspired by this idea that he was able to really distance himself from Donald Trump, knowing from the cruelty and the way that he had completely dehumanized immigrants at the southern border. And that was a winning message for them. And so in a state like Arizona, where there are so many mixed status families, where there are thousands of dreamers, where there are hundreds and thousands of undocumented people, in a state like Arizona that still carries the trauma of someone like Joe Arpaio and that is currently facing a proposition that threatens to take that state back to the days of Joe Arpaio, I wonder, Jose, if the vice president's messaging on immigration, which are center-right, would work in a place like that. And I think people are looking for something different. I think they're looking more for a 2020 message. And so I wonder if that'll really stick with people there.
You know, I'm just wondering, Paola, because, you know, I remember how much of an impact SB 1070 had on Arizona, and then not just the impact that it had when it was instituted, but then later as it was chiseled away because of the strong unconstitutional aspects to it. But does that SB 1070 still carry a weight in Arizona? It
carries so much weight, Jose. I was talking to so many people. Right now, so folks understand, there is an immigration ballot in the Arizona November election. What that ballot would do is essentially deputize local law enforcement, like policemen, to act as de facto Border Patrol agents. It makes it a state crime to cross the southern border. And so that is literally taking people back. Latino families back to the era of Joe Arpaio. I mean, I was even having conversations with voters, Jose, that are actually talking about the idea of self-deporting if Donald Trump wins in November. They're talking amongst themselves. I talked to a mother that is actually trying to figure out who would have custody of her U.S.-born children if Donald Trump wins. And so that trauma doesn't leave. That trauma mobilizes people like it did in November 2020. And so the question is, will the vice president be able to re-energize people having a more positive immigration message or not?
And Stuart, Trump is leading Harris by more than 20 points on this issue, according to the latest NBC polling. So why is this disparity so wide?
Well, first, let me say, I just started Paula's book, and I'm finding it fascinating. I'd urge everybody to read it. It gets into an area that we rarely talk about that I think is super important. Look, I don't think this race is about immigration. I think that she's going to continue to trail on immigration. But for most people, immigration is not their number one issue. It just doesn't affect that many people. And I think to the degree that the Trump campaign has overstepped this, like what they've done in Springfield, it really reduces the effectiveness of the message. You know, if you go back to the Reagan party, Reagan announced in front of the Statue of Liberty as a sign to welcome immigrants. His last speech was an ode to immigrants. He signed a bill that made everyone in the country before 1976 legal. So there still is a part of the Republican Party that finds this whole tone of this to be distasteful and angry and hurtful and not productive. So I think we're not going to be sitting there on election night and say that Vice President Harris lost on immigration.
Paula, I got to say, I am so proud of, for so many reasons and on so many levels, of you and what you are now, accomplishing, and your strength and just, anyway, I'm not going to get into it. I'm just so proud of you.
You always make me
this
blush,
book,
okay?
But it's just, let's talk about defectors, the rise of the Latino far right, what it means for America. So among the things that you highlight in this book, which I agree with Stuart on, everybody's got to get, is the growing number of Latinos, many immigrants or children of immigrants, who oppose unrestricted immigration. Explain how that apparent dichotomy exists.
Look, I think, just as a bottom line, I think we should be alarmed at the idea that someone like Donald Trump in a state like Arizona is polling close to 40% with Latino voters. And part of that is because there is a small but growing group of Latino voters that are warming up to the idea of mass deportation. And just to be very brief, I think what Trumpism is betting on is this idea that there's a segment of Latinos that have become so Americanized and so assimilated, that they too can sort of tap into the nativism, and they too can tap into the otherizing and the sort of us versus them game. There's a lot of research out there to sort of ground us in the fear that some Latinos are feeling in this moment. When you look at the way that anti-Latino hate crimes have been steadily rising over the last 8 years, when it actually really spikes? When mainstream media, when Donald Trump, when politicians pay so much attention to this idea of an invasion at the southern border, this idea of chaos, of immigrants being criminals, and there are some Latinos that do not want to be lumped with immigrants, that want to sort of protect themselves from that type of discrimination and hatred. And so that sort of explains why some Latinos, in that quest to prove that they too are American, would sort of find something appealing in Trumpism.
Stuart Stevens and Paula Ramos, thank you both so very much. Paula, let's come back soon and talk a little bit more about your book, et cetera. Really appreciate it.